Hello, everyone. My name is Colin Walker. I'm the head of transport at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. I imagine a lot of you don't know who we are. We refer to ourselves as the ECIU for short. We largely exist to ensure that all the debates surrounding the net zero transition are informed by the facts. That involves a lot of analysis, placing it into the media and doing an awful lot of fact checking and engaging with a lot of the misinformation we see around all elements of net zero transition. My responsibility is focusing on all the stuff that we see in the world of transport. The reality is that most of the misinformation we engage with or we witness surrounds electric vehicles, and certainly the whole debate around charging infrastructure is not immune to that. So I'm obviously here with Vicky Edmonds from EVA England, so I don't want to take up too much time, and she can speak with much greater expertise to some of the issues relating to an equitable rollout of EV charging infrastructure. But yeah, from my perspective, a few things to consider when talking about this topic. The uneven geographical distribution that you've alluded to, we know all about. Places like London, Scotland, and the West Midlands, comparatively well served, particularly London. Northern Ireland, a very poor performer when it comes to total devices per 100,000 population, and also places like Yorkshire, the Northwest, and East Mids also lagging behind some of the stronger performers. There's a whole question about the quality of a charging experience. I know Vicky can speak to more on behalf of her members. But the two issues I'd particularly like to focus on are the challenges we have in the variation in costs that exist when it comes to charging an electric vehicle, particularly between those who can charge at home and those that can't, and the impact of misinformation around EV charging infrastructure, which I think is presenting us quite a few problems. So starting with the variation in cost piece, as I say, there is a huge variation in cost in running an EV, depending on whether or not you can charge your vehicle at home or if you can't. Now, what often blows quite a few people's minds, particularly on the murky world of social media in which I have to engage, is the fact that a majority of households can charge their vehicles at home. A majority of households, around about 60 to 70%, do have access to private off-street parking. That can enable them to access the cheap nighttime tariffs offered by the likes of Octopus that can make running an EV cost as little as and even less than 2p a mile. Compare that to 15p a mile plus for a comparable petrol or diesel vehicle. But whilst that is great news for that majority, it still leaves a very sizable minority that can't. They have to rely on public charging. The reality is that relying entirely on public charging to fuel your in inverted commas your EV kind of significantly erodes or even completely removes the running cost advantages that an EV can have over a petrol equivalent. And the added complexity to that is that often, certainly not in all cases, but often households without private driveways are typically in some of the poor quintiles than, say, households with private driveways. And, that results in quite a perverse situation emerging in which EVs are cheaper to run if you're richer, more expensive to run if you're poorer. And some very challenging narratives are beginning to emerge, and I suspect are likely to become more prevalent and louder in the years ahead. And that is the sense that the EV transition is going to see poorer households being left behind. Poorer people are going to be forced into more expensive electric vehicles in the midst of a cost of living crisis. And also that EVs are very much a plaything of the rich, which obviously those narratives are all interrelated. And my concern about this is that these narratives are increasingly going to be used as sticks with which to beat the EV transition by those that resist it. I'm sure many people on this call will be familiar with an awful lot of the EV misinformation we see in a number of our media outlets, particularly online. Any opportunity to talk down EVs or to cast doubt about them is typically exploited. And I think there'll be some unscrupulous characters who will feign an interest in equitability when it comes to the EV transition to use these perverse narratives, these kind of challenging narratives, as a means of kind of casting doubt on the EV transition and trying to slow it down. In terms of what needs to be done, and more than happy to kind of open this out into conversation after I've stopped chatting, is I think there are two main things. One, I think it's challenging this kind of gap between the haves and the have-nots. One of the things that can be done is to make it a lot easier for people without driveways to be able to charge their cars at home. And one of the obvious solutions to that is to remove the planning obstacles that currently exist for people who want to install cross-payment charging solutions, whether it's gullies or overhead beams, that allow them to charge their vehicles if they live in a terraced house, for example, without public charging. That will help a significant proportion of that minority that don't have private charging access to cheap electricity available to them at home that will make running an electric vehicle really cheap. That's one area that really needs to be focused on. And I think the other needs to be broadly the need to bring down the cost of public charging, so the gap between the cost of charging at home and the cost of charging publicly isn't as great as it currently is. There are a few solutions to this. One of the most obvious being equalising VAT. It's currently 5% on electricity at home. It's 20% on electricity at public charging sites. There are organisations out there such as Fair Charge who are campaigning for that to be equalised and for the VAT on public charging to be brought down to 5%. That is a fairly obvious solution to address that problem. I've heard some interesting things from the likes of Ian Johnson at Osprey talk about, what are some of the factors that are responsible for public charging being so high in certain places. There's a LinkedIn post I can probably try and share that goes into a lot more detail about this. But, he talked about how the standing charges that some charge point operators have to pay have risen by up to 1,000%, which is obviously kind of like, put a significant margin on their cost, which has had to be passed on to the consumer. What can be done to address some of those issues? And what else can be done to allow CBOs to benefit from carbon credits like they do in Europe, which he estimates could bring down the cost of public charging from by 5 to 10p. So there are policy solutions available to government that we know this government is very much focused on driving economic growth through investment, but it also doesn't have a huge amount of money. And I do think the whole charging debate is one of those wonderful areas where investment in our charging infrastructure that could release billions of pounds in investments in our economy could be unlocked if some of the barriers that exist are removed, and that could be done through planning reform rather than the injection of large amounts of capital. The other issue that I kind of wanted to touch on is the impact of misinformation, which I think is holding back the EV transition. That's, as I mentioned, that issue about EV misinformation certainly applies to what is being said about electric vehicle charging. There are some entirely legitimate concerns about EV charging that needs to be addressed, but there's also a lot of misinformation about charging and about EVs doing the rounds in general. So much so that the House of Lords Environment Committee last year identified EV misinformation as a major barrier holding back the UK's EV transition and called on the government to do a lot more, be a lot more proactive in working with stakeholders to tackle it. This is something I have to engage with on a day-to-day basis for my sins, and one of the tactics that is used repeatedly is this idea of poltering, a word I'd never heard of before I joined the ECIU. And that is a form of deception where truthful statements are used to create a misleading impression. So certain elements of charging infrastructure, for example, that are problematic, such as possibly access to chargers during kind of big bank holiday getaways, are often used to create the misleading impression that this is a reality that EV drivers will face on a daily basis, which quite naturally will put prospective EV drivers off the notion of getting an electric vehicle. And we've done some polling that's looked at the impact of that misinformation. And it's found that it's really affecting people's understanding of EVs and their willingness to consider making the move to electric driving. We did an EV knowledge test last year of 1,000 non-EV drivers with YouGov. We gave them 10 statements about electric vehicles and asked them to kind of assess whether or not they were accurate or inaccurate, and gave them a score if they got it correct. We found that more than half of non-EV drivers scored less than 2 out of 10 right in our EV knowledge test. 90% got 5 or less right, and almost a quarter got 0 right. And we also found that those who scored badly, such as getting 2 or less out of 10, are 11 times less likely to want their next car to be an EV than those who scored well, who got 8 or more out of 10. And I think that kind of illustrates the fact that misinformation is having an effect in informing or distorting people's understanding of EVs, and it is also having an effect in that it is encouraging them to act against their interests and choose not to make the transition to what is in effect cheaper and cleaner driving. We went into this in a little more detail. We found that nearly 2/3 of petrol drivers believe it's more expensive to own and run an EV with only 14% correctly recognising that EVs are typically cheaper to own and operate over their lifetimes. We found that 80% of petrol drivers think that the UK is not on course to install the charging infrastructure it needs, despite the country being ahead of its schedule to hit its target of 300,000 chargers on UK roads by 2030. And we did some more work on that and looking at the difference between the perception of EV ownership and the perception of EV charging that is held by petrol car drivers and the reality as experienced by EV drivers. So, for example, we found that 4 in 5 petrol car drivers think EV drivers have to use public chargers at least once a week, when in reality, less than 1 in 5 EV drivers report having to do so. In fact, almost 3/4 of EV drivers use public charging just once a month or less. We found another perception, which was that more than half of petrol car drivers think EV drivers run out of charge at least once a year. The reality is that over 80% of EV drivers reported to us that they had never run out of charge, a big gap between perception and reality. So I just wanted to kind of like end my bit on the issue of misinformation, which is one of the best ways to tackle misinformation, particularly around the realities of charging, is to address some of the legitimate concerns that people have about charging, to remove the opportunities for poultering, to remove the opportunities to create misleading impressions about EV charging. And that one of the things I'd love to see more action on is reducing that premium that people have to pay to charge their cars publicly compared to charging them at home. I do think we need to see a lot more proactive work from industry and government to tackle EV misinformation, and that those that peddle it need to be held to account, which is certainly something we try to do at the ECIU by requesting corrections from journalists, sometimes having to resort to going to IPSO, the independent press regulator, to try and ensure that corrections are made so misleading information about EVs isn't further disseminated. Sorry, I couldn't, that's pretty much the end for me. Sorry, I couldn't kind of share my slides, but I can certainly send them on, but I'll, it's okay, hand over to Vicky for her to do her bit.
So yes, so thanks very much, Colin. So as Colin said, I'm the Chief Executive of EVA England, which is a members association. So we sort of represent the electric vehicle driver, and we lobby on their behalf to, I guess, effect real change, both in government policy, within parliamentary debates and with industry. So I think just to, build on what Colin said, we do regular surveys of drivers through our networks, primarily EV drivers, but also some non-EV drivers, just to keep our fingers on the pulse of what they think is affecting or kind of holding up the transition to electric. And I think drivers sort of concur with a lot of what Colin said. So I say there are 3 big areas. One is misinformation, I think overwhelmingly, and I think Colin is the expert on that, so I won't dwell on that, but I think we sort of repeat calls that needs a more coordinated effort to tackle from government level, as well as the efforts of organisations like ECIU and some of the others in the industry. But the 2 sort of biggest I think tangible driver issues are there's still the upfront cost of purchasing an electric vehicle, which is still significantly higher. So it's over 20% higher to purchase an equivalent electric car to what your favoured petrol or diesel car might be. And as Colin said, that charging divide between those who have driveways and can charge cheaply and those who don't. And I think those are the 2 sort of equity issues that as an organisation we lobby for on behalf of drivers and try to make change on. If I flick to the next slide, has that worked? Yes. So I think in terms of the solutions and the things that we're asking for to see a difference in, and to, I guess, just help people have reassurance that they can afford these cars and that they're going to be accessible to them, I think there are 3 main areas on the equity side. So one is tackling this charging divide, and as Colin's touched on, I think the cost of charging is very, very high, public charging, and there are a number of factors that drive that. The VAT on public charge points being much higher than for domestic charging is a real issue. Electricity reform is going on, but whether it's putting charging at its heart is questionable, and that's the only way to bring down some of the quite big kind of chunks of the bill that we see that charge point operators have to pay network operators just in order to install and get charge points up and running. So I think that those are 2 sort of government policy areas. Cross pavement solutions, again, Colin has touched on, is really important. So it allows people to access their home energy tariffs, but they are complicated at the moment to install, especially if you're a driver. So they are very expensive, and there are a lot of planning issues that need to be overcome. So it can take over a year from application to get your cross pavement solution in, or not at all, as some drivers have found. Some councils are just very against them, and so that is a bit of a wild west, but it is a necessary part of the charging ecosystem as we roll out. We want people to be able to access those cheaper charging rates and to reduce their charging tariffs. So as Colin said, a lot of that is down to planning reform. So we're doing some work on the planning bill in the House at the moment. We've had an amendment tabled by an MP to ask government to relax the planning rules around cross pavement and to try to help roll that out. I think the other thing we always talk about is workplace charging. So many drivers get into their cars because their employers offer a decent tariff in the workplace, and it just becomes a more convenient way for them to use and refuel their cars. I think there isn't enough focus on that. Government has grants, they're not very well used. We want government to kind of restructure those grants and roll them out across public sector sites like NHS parking sites, schools, sort of police authorities, councils, and to think about how employers could actually make these grants more attractive to employers, because I think for small businesses it is still very expensive to install charge points in your area. So I think that's a whole area that isn't often talked about, but we think is very important for the driver. And then there's a lot industry can do itself. So the prices are high for them, but they need to attract business, they need to attract customers, and things like variable pricing for residents, residential tariffs, charge sharing, these technologies are all coming, perhaps not at the pace that we want to see. So as I say, we don't just lobby government, we don't just lobby sort of national and local authorities, we also lobby industry to say, actually, is there more that you could be doing here to support the resident and just to get people more reassured that this is a sector that they can afford, and get more people into the cars as a result. I think the second area is access to charging. So, and by access, we very much mean can you find the charge point? Can you get hold of one? And can you access it, particularly if you're a user with a disability? So we work very hard on what's known as this PAS 1899 standard, which allows all users, including those with disabilities, to use a charge point. At the moment, the standard is not well used for various different reasons. It is currently being revised. The new standard ought to be rolled out early next year, and we are pushing for it to be mandated or at least for government to have the powers to mandate it if it doesn't get rolled out voluntarily, because at the moment, those people turning back from EVs, a proportion of them are drivers with disabilities who just cannot use the public charging infrastructure. And for them, this is just not a workable solution. So for us, that's another really important piece of work that we really push on, and we really try to keep the pace up on and make sure that it happens. We've talked a bit about also just people without driveways, but there are also a lot of people who rent or are leaseholders, and they don't have automatic access to private charging, even if they have a driveway or a parking spot. And again, we're asking for changes in the law to give them a right to request a charge. And when you factor them in on top of those without driveways, we estimate you could be talking almost at half the driving community, which is a significant chunk of people who are not going to be easily accessing cheap charging going forward. So again, that's a real area for us. And then we also, things like charge point signage and payment processes, just making the whole system easier for drivers to use, is another area that we lobby on. So there are hardly any charge point signs around. Why not? Why can't we do more on that? And also just the payment processes, they just be really sticky for users. So, being able to pay with contactless when you want to, not having to have multiple subscriptions and apps to use the sort of lower powered charge points. So those are all areas that we are still pushing on, that have been around for quite a while, but still perhaps aren't making enough progress. And then we come to cars and the upfront cost. So, there are various kind of, I know I listened to the end of the conversation before and kind of what do people want from the spending review today. I am not optimistic that large, more chunks of money are going to be given out. I think it's really clear that money is very tight at the moment, but there are big pots of money kind of that OZEV already have, that government already have. And there's also pots of money like the National Wealth Fund, which is an equity fund. Some of it is an equity fund ring-fenced just for sort of green infrastructure projects. So there are existing pots, and I guess our point to government is, are they being used in the right way to help everyone access this market? So we are also working on kind of schemes that help strengthen the used car market and lower the cost of EVs. There are schemes that operate elsewhere in the world. So France has a very good social leasing scheme, which offers low-cost loans to households with lower incomes who have to use their car for work and commuting. Scotland has a used EV loan scheme, which is applicable to cars and vans and taxis. So our question to the UK government is, why can't we roll something out similar that in England, and why can't you use the existing pots of money you have to structure sort of guarantee and loan schemes to support lower income households because other people have done it. So I think for us, I think we're just asking to take a long, hard look at the money that is available and make sure that it's actually being used in the right way and targeted at the right people. I personally don't necessarily think that you need another plug-in car grant for the new car market, because actually there's a lot of very wealthy people who aren't buying these cars for different reasons, be that misinformation or mistrust, and that's another issue to tackle. I think what the money now needs to target is making sure that these vehicles are accessible to everyone, because that's the mass market that we now need to promote, and we now need to make sure we can transition. And then I'll say a bit about batteries as well. Battery certification. No one trusts the batteries, especially on the second-hand market. Sometimes there's a good reason. I think people don't really understand how to look after the car batteries, or they don't care. So fleets, I think, want to max these cars out. There's an awful lot of work to do around care of the battery, and then also just providing reassurance to people buying on the second-hand market that these batteries do work. And the majority really do. So I think, we hear, I think it is rare for batteries to be massively degraded by the time you get it, but it does happen. And that sort of just having some kind of battery certification process, I think, will help just improve that part of the kind of the care of the car as well. So that's a bit of a rattle through, I think, all of the things that we as an organisation think are needed to create complete equity as we work towards this transition to electric vehicles. But yeah, happy to take any questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Colin and Vicky. And I think it is really important to highlight, a lot of that misinformation that goes around there. I think, Colin, you're exactly right. There are scare stories in the news quite often about owning an EV. And I own an EV myself, and I can always say that a lot of people will have access to home charging, and they think that they're going to rely on public charging 100% of the time. I can honestly say I haven't used a public charger since GridServe offered free charging at Christmas. I didn't need it, but it's free, so why not? And I think there are a lot of people in my situation who will have driveways and just don't think that, like, where will I charge? Well, at home. And also, how often do you do a journey that's 200 plus miles? Not very often. So it is very important that we do address that misinformation. And I appreciate both of you taking the time to make sure that was definitely in there and highlighted. We do have a question from someone. And it's all about business users. For business users, HMRC fuel rates are insufficient for EVs. If you need to use public charging infrastructure, is this being considered?
I can confess to not knowing a lot about this, because we represent the individual driver, and actually we do have fleet drivers in our membership, but we don't hear much from them as much as we do from kind of just passenger car drivers who just really want to feedback on some of their kind of bugbears. I mean, I think what I do hear is that it is very favourable for fleets to roll out EVs because of the company car schemes and the kind of salary sacrifice benefit kind, and that is one of the primary reasons that people are getting into electric cars, is there is an economic benefit to their business or to the drivers themselves. The whole kind of refueling and how you get that money back, kind of if you're out on the road and you're kind of charging at public charge points, is actually something I think that's been around a really long time. So actually I'm really interested that is still there, because I hadn't heard of it since taking on this role back in January, and I kind of assumed that for those that fleets had a plan for kind of for kind of making sure that sort of people were rebated for their refueling costs. But if it isn't happening, then it's just really useful for us to know that, and actually just really keen to hear more about that, and maybe some price comparisons as well would be really helpful for us.
Yeah, I think because I do my own tax return, and HMRC expenses are great for fueling if you're fueling at home, because actually you make a profit, because the fuel rate is obviously lower than my home electricity rate. But obviously out and about, when you're paying some charges like 80 odd p per kilowatt hour, obviously that is nowhere near sufficient. So I definitely think that this person is right, that it is insufficient and probably does need to be addressed. But I guess we don't fully know the answer, but that is the main question we have received. I don't think we have any more. Nope, that is all. But thank you, Vicky, and thank you, Colin, for that insightful conversation. It is massively appreciated.